in the Sunday National, just there on the 22nd of September 2024, this was the headline: Reform could scupper deal by unionists. What was meant here? A Reform UK breakthrough in Holyrood could throw the Scottish Parliament into disarray, threatening to deprive both unionists and pro-independence parties of a majority. Now, remember that at the Scottish election, everybody has 2 votes, the first for a party in their constituency, the second for a party in their region. Constituency votes are first past the post. Regional votes are by proportional representation, and it is on the regional ballot that Reform could really make a breakthrough. If they were to get the percentage that they got at the general election just passed, then they would get at least 1 candidate in every region. So that would be 8 MSPs, and that would certainly cause problems, because it would deprive, that candidate may come in at the expense of an SNP candidate, or a Green candidate, or a Labour or Tory candidate. So Reform is threatening all of these parties, because the final candidate elected in each region is likely to displace a candidate from one of the main parties. And that will then mean that the SNP, for example, won't necessarily have a ruling majority. It could fall that the Labour people don't have a ruling majority, and that coalitions are going to have to be formed if there is to be a quote-unquote government. And Professor Curtis here has been contacted about it. And Curtis told the Sunday National, quote, "The problem of Reform for Labour is this: it's not necessarily how many votes or even seats they might take off them. Well, that is actually a problem. It's that Reform are going to be regarded by Labour as uncoalitionable." I've never seen that phrase written down, uncoalitionable, which means that if there are Reform candidates elected, Labour won't want to do a coalition with them. Well, more pity for Labour then. Labour are just putting themselves out of government then. If by doing a coalition with Reform, they could get a majority, Labour are still not going to do that. According to Professor Curtis, maybe things will change nearer the time, but that looks like the situation at the moment. Would the SNP do a coalition with Reform in order to achieve government? Well, that's very unlikely indeed. In fact, and here's a bit of a worry, it's more likely that the SNP and Labour together would do a coalition. And that's already been suggested, and it's being suggested in this article. Or it may be that Labour, Lib Dems and Tories together will somehow do a coalition to keep SNP, Greens and Reform out. But what it is saying is that Reform is very much the fox in the henhouse. And that's the kind of parties and that's the kind of chaos that we quite like to see, especially if it causes problems for the SNP, and especially if it causes problems for the Labour, Lib Dem, Greens and Tories, none of whom have spoken up properly in Scotland against mass immigration, against the small boats, and against resettling the fraudulent asylum seekers here in Scotland. So they'll all deserve what they get come 2026, no question about that.